in example 1, we have a function y equals f of x that is over the domain of all real numbers. And so they want me to approximate the coordinates of the relative extrema. Okay, so we do have a relative minimum located at approximately negative 1.5, negative 6. So relative min, negative 1.5, negative 6. And we also have a relative max located approximately here, and that looks to be maybe 1.56. Now, considering the domain, which is all real numbers, what are the absolute extrema of the function? Well, here my function is going to negative infinity, here it's going to positive infinity, and so actually there are no absolute extrema since the function is unbounded. And again, that's due to the fact that our domain has not been restricted. If I had a closed interval here, then my endpoints could possibly be absolute extrema. In part B, I do have a function g of x over a closed interval. And so in this case, we can take a look at relative and absolute minima and maxima. So let's take a look. I have a relative, I have actually more than one. Relative minima are located at negative 3, negative 3, and I also have one over here at 1, negative 5. Relative maxima, let's take a look. So relative maxima are going to be at negative 1, positive 1, and also at 3, 5. All right, now the domain of this function is actually negative 5 to positive 5, and that is a closed interval, meaning that those two endpoints are included, and I know that because they've used shaded circles to indicate them. And so with that in mind, do I have any absolute extrema? So the absolute extrema will be the highest and lowest points. So let's take a look. Absolute minima, I do have one, and that is at 1, negative 5. So that would be this point here. And then for an absolute maximum, that is going to be at 3, 5. Alright, now in 1c, they tell me to consider both functions and their domains. Where do the extrema occur on the interval or at endpoints? Do the relative extrema occur at the function's absolute extrema? So let's think about what was going on here. Alright, so extrema can occur at the endpoints or on the intervals. It's also possible for absolute extremes to also be the same as the relative extremes. We saw that happened in example 1b. So in particular on g of x, the relative extrema in a neighborhood, the neighborhood is just a local interval, was also an absolute extrema. Now in 1D, they have restricted my domain, in this case, instead of all real numbers. Even though this is an unbounded and continuous function, they've told me to only consider the domain to be negative 2 to positive 2. That is going to change things up a little bit, maybe. Let's take a look at absolute extrema. So let's see. Absolute maximum. So from negative 2 to positive 2, I do have an absolute maximum, and this is going to be 1.56. And if you'll recall, that was the relative maxima from earlier on this same function. All right, what about an absolute minimum? Let's take a look. So on the same interval from -2 to 2, I do have an absolute minimum. Again, -1.5, -6, and no surprises, that was the relative minimum from earlier as well. All right, so now they want me to look at an even tighter interval. -1 is less than or equal to x is less than or equal to 2. What are the absolute extrema of the function? Well, let's take a look. Absolute maximum on that interval from -1 to 2 is still going to be 1.56. That hasn't changed. And the absolute minimum on this interval is going to be located at -1, and this will be an end point on that interval, and it's going to be -1, -3. Now in 1e, we're going to take that same graph of g of x and we're going to restrict its domain from -3 to +3, and we're going to see what happens in this case. So here we do have an absolute maximum, and that is going to be located at 3, 5. And let's check out the possibility of an absolute minimum. Okay, so from -3 to +3, I do have a value here at -3, -3, but now I also have +1, -5, and that is still going to be my absolute minimum, +1, -5. Now they want me to open this up to include -5 to 2, and let's do this again. So absolute max from -5 to 2 is going to be located at -5, 4, and that is an end point, -5, 4. Now let's look at the absolute min, and I have a min here, and then here's my other endpoint at 2, and my absolute min looks like it's going to be 1, -5. Alright, so my absolute maxima and minima can change as I change the intervals that I'm evaluating over.